So I'm Nicole Young. I'm one of the consultants along with Kristal Caballero and Nicole Lezen, who facilitates a county-wide initiative called the Collective of Results and Evidence-Based or CORE Investments. And we're co-hosting today's training along with Eva Holt Rusmore, who's the project consultant for DataShare Santa Cruz County. And today's session is held in English with Spanish interpretation. So Kristal is providing consecutive interpretation right now, and will also translate written comments and questions that are in the chat. And soon we'll switch to simultaneous interpretation provided by Stella Lauerman. We're going to go on and say a little bit about what CORE Investments is as one of the co-hosts for this session. So again, CORE stands for the Collective of Results and Evidence-Based Investments. And the mission of CORE is to inspire and ignite collective action to ensure Santa Cruz County is a safe, healthy community with equitable opportunities for all to thrive and experience these 8 interconnected core conditions for health and well-being. So when we say equitable health and well-being, we mean that people's opportunities and their quality of life aren't predictable for better or for worse by things like race, ethnicity, income, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, or any of the other ways that people identify themselves. And so we partner with agencies and groups like DataShare to align our efforts so that we're working towards common goals. I'm going to turn it over to Eva right now to tell us a little bit about DataShare.
Good morning. Thanks, Nicole. My name is Eva Holt, and I am a consultant working out of Santa Cruz County, and I'm a project consultant with DataShare. I have been working on this project since 2021. And if you're less familiar with the platform, it is an interactive data platform with 400 indicators from local, state, and national sources. And we aim to have an updated version of all the data and the local reports that are in our library. Um, and the platform is constantly changing. The data library is constantly changing with new indicators and analysis being added. We are the central hub of information for the county around health and well-being indicators. And this allows for creation of alignment to measure shared outcomes with the same metrics and data. We also are able to do this in the community with easy visualization of previously static data sets and to integrate data sets such as the safety net clinic utilization data that has previously not been available to the public in an easy and accessible way. Students, researchers, advocacy groups, evaluators, grant writers, and fundraisers all have leveraged the platform for their particular goals. And to frame our conversation today, I just wanted to also talk a little bit about DataShare's equity principles. So in addition to offering this data library, we put a lot of thought and commitment into how we do the data work so that we're aligned with these principles. And do you mind? Next slide, please. Thank you. So in order to ensure that our work truly benefits everyone in our community, we've developed these 8 equity principles in our collaborative to guide our decisions and actions, and they help us prioritize data, build capacity, and communicate clearly. And if you want to go to the next slide, please. We apply these principles. Oh, I'm sorry. Previous one. Thank you. We apply these principles to our data work in many ways. For example, we're able to combine data sources. So we blend the large national data sets with smaller local ones. We use diverse data. So we include both the quantitative data and the stories. And we aim to always involve the community when we work with people and their analysis. So, for example, we recently did a data spotlight partnership with the Youth Action Network to highlight and talk about the differences in youth and adult partnership and youth resilience, what the data says locally, and the interpretations of locally produced data versus what national data sets are saying about youth resilience. And that was has been a really great partnership with UCSC and United Way. So by doing this kind of work, we can create a more accurate and equitable picture of our community. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit more about data equity. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our main presenters, Erika and Azucena. Welcome.
Thank you, Eva and Nicole and Kristal and everybody who helped make this possible. My name is Erika. We are Azucena and I are from the Institute for Social Transformation. And next slide, please. Here's who we are. I'll introduce myself and then I'll turn it over to Azucena. And these are our pictures from our professional website. So do we look the same? I'm not sure. I am the training coordinator, and I am working on a project called the Community Economic Mobilization Initiative, which is a statewide initiative that works on preparing grassroots organizations, supporting grassroots organizations to access various levels of public funding, something that the Institute has been involved in. We are providing technical assistance on that project, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, but I'll turn it over to Azucena first.
And hello, I am Azucena, and I am project manager over at the Institute for Social Transformation. And yeah, I'm tuning in from Joshua Tree area. So just mentioning that out there, I think people usually assume I'm on campus, but I actually have a hybrid-ish position. So yeah. And then I think Erika will go through some background on the Institute and also more details on CEMI. So I'll pass it back to you, Erika.
Great. Next slide. So I imagine some of you are already already know about the Institute for Social Transformation at UC Santa Cruz. We're in the social sciences division, and we do a variety of things to support innovative scholarship that changes the world. So that means really what we are after is making sure that the scholarship in the ivory tower is reaching the community, and that the community is also reaching and influencing scholarship. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. But our job basically is to connect all of this research and knowledge that's happening in these institutions with all of the research and expertise that's happening on the ground to make really concrete change. Next slide. So CEMI, the Community Economic Mobilization Initiative, which is the project that both Azucena and I work on, is an initiative of the Sierra Health Foundation. And as I said earlier, it works to equip and uplift community organizations to do inclusive economic development in their locality, in their cities and regions, and maybe even statewide as we get further along in the project. We are technical assistance providers as part of the Community Economic Mobilization Initiative. So we're working with about 70 or so organizations across the state, all across the state. Working to help support and build capacity in the community to participate in economic development conversations. We also just want to say that the two other technical assistance providers that are part of our team are the Equity Research Institute, which is down at USC, and also Policy Link, which is another national organization that does progressive policy work. And so much of what you're going to see today is actually a collaboration between all three organizations, and we'll try to point out when each of our organizations can take credit for the different pieces. next slide, I'll turn it back to Azucena.
All right. Well, I know a lot of you already saw the learning objectives when you were registering, but for those of you who haven't, we'll briefly go over them. We have 3 learning objectives in this learning session, and they are to understand and recognize the role that power plays in the production, interpretation, and communication of data, and the impact it has on racial equity in planning and policy decisions. We also want to learn to critique the assumption that legitimate knowledge about community only comes from formally educated researchers and not from community members and their day-to-day experiences. And then lastly, we want to lead with frameworks and tools for partnering with community members to analyze and present data in ways that honor the expertise that everybody brings to the table and that is necessary to achieve equitable regional systems and processes. Next slide. So our agenda for this learning session are to go over some key concepts for data justice. We will have an activity on who has power. And I think we might have flipped around the agenda, but it says key concepts on research justice, overview and discussion of the knowledge factory. We'll have some space for thoughts, reactions, and questions, and then we summarize the learning session with the key takeaways that we want you to leave with. And I believe, next slide. I think I'm turning it over to, okay.
No, it's keep on slide 5. Keep on the other slide. Go back. Yeah, there we go. So, sorry, we have a little, we are going to do an activity in a moment that Azucena is going to lead. But before we do that, I just wanted to do a little warm up. I know that, excuse me, that you're putting your names and excuse me, organizations in the chat. But we're also just going to get a quick sense of who's in the room. And so if you have access to split your screen and look at the squares of the people, I'm going to ask you to use your reaction buttons, the thumbs up or the thumbs down. And I'm going to ask 3 questions. There are no right or wrong answers to these questions, but they're sort of continuum organizations. And so thank you. So if you imagine on one side is the thumbs up and on the other side is the thumbs down. Most of your organizations, and I know most of us, fall somewhere in the middle, but we're on Zoom. So what can we do? If you're closer to the yes side of to answer the question, you're going to give a thumbs up on the screen. And if you're closer to the no side of answering the question, then you put a thumbs down on your screen. Any questions about that before? Very quick activity, just to get a sense of who's here. Great. So the first question is, at my organization, we regularly talk about and use data to shape our work and our public messages. So if you're on the thumbs up side, you're actively using data in every aspect of your work. And if you're on the thumbs down side, you're totally new to this data stuff and don't really use it. Okay, great. So we got a lot of thumbs up. Excellent. 1 thumbs down. Brave soul. Thank you, Katke. Okay, great. The second question is, or the statement is, there is generally good and accurate data available about what's happening in my community related to the work that my organization does. So thumbs up for there's lots of good detailed data, and thumbs down for no, there's no data at all. Again, these are spectrum questions. If you're closer to the no side, you're going to do this. If you're closer to the yes side, you're going to do this. Okay, so a mix, a little bit of a mix. Excellent. Okay, the final question is, I am familiar with the concept of data or research justice. So thumbs up if you're an expert. Thumbs up side is you're an expert. Thumbs down is I am not familiar with it at all. Okay, so we got a good mix of that too. Well, oh, good. We've got more thumbs down. Excellent, because we are good. That is exactly what we're going to be talking about. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. I really just wanted to get a sense of folks in the room. Um, but if you have any reactions to any of those questions, quickly, you can either pop them in the chat, or if there's anyone brave to come off mute and wants to share reactions or surprises, we're open to that too. Okay, great. Hearing none, I will pass it back to Azucena. We will do, and we'll go to that slide about who has the power and do our small research justice activity.
So we could go to the next slide. Okay. So I am going to read, we're going to go into an activity about who's got the power. And I'm going to read a scenario, and then we'll show you on the same slide some questions that we have for you based on the scenario. So I'll be reading it. I'll go slow and I'd say, yeah, I just go slow. So the scenario is a family who lives near large agricultural fields suffers from asthma caused by the pesticides and pollution. The mother reports this verbally at the local city council hearing. She says many of her neighbors and coworkers shared this experience. She is dismissed by the city officials, saying there is no connection between her family's asthma and the fields. The following month, the Environmental Protection Agency sent a report to the city council saying that asthma in the area is caused by pesticides and other pollutants from nearby farms. The city council declares immediate action should be taken. And we could show, I have some questions, and I think we can show them now. And please feel welcome to either do your response in the chat or come off mute. But our questions are, how is the community voice regarded in this situation, and why was it regarded that way? How is the institutional voice regarded, and why? And then who are the people in power most likely to listen to, and why? So this is just a scenario that happens every day, I'm sure, in a lot of these farm working communities, and it also happens in other communities, which not related to farming, but this is just a scenario. And it's the kind of experience that not only highlights how like research injustice impacts communities, but it also clearly shows some levels of inequity. So I wanted to get a sense of like your thoughts in the chat or come off mute, answering some of these questions. Or you could react. How is the community voice regarded? You could arise with an angry emoji or a happy emoji. We'll welcome any input you feel energized enough to share. So we got community voice was disregarded. Institutional voice was legitimatized. they were seen as the expert, and the council holds the power to act or not act. Thank you. I don't want to butcher the name, Sigolene Ortega or Sigolene.
Good morning, good buenos dias. Yes, it's Igualen. Yeah, I'm a big introvert, so I tend to use the chat. So I appreciate the call to let us use the chat and to do reactions. But yeah, I think that when you went through that scenario, it was a little in this case it was straightforward. Sometimes our community could be listened to, but action takes a long time, right? Because it does matter how the information is presented. So just in that scenario, it was at least clear cut in terms of the questions. But in terms of who holds the power, I think this is why you're having this webinar this morning, is to empower us to elevate their voices, and how do we center around the voices and experience of our community so they know they hold the power, and that there's ways to kind of pressure to get action.
Thank you for coming off mute. But yeah, anybody else that has thoughts to share, you're welcome to the chat. I'll give you about a minute more. We did go with more of I'd say the more day-to-day scenarios are more complex than the one I just read. But this is just for the sake of like just exercising and getting that discussion started. All right. So I think we will go to the next slide. So who's got the power? So we're going to go over some indicators of research oppression in our communities. The example previously, like the scenario shows how like there's research injustice and how it impacts in like the marginalized communities. So let's go over how what are indicators of other research oppressions. So community voices and experiences are dismissed or ignored. Like in the scenario, the complaint was just dismissed by the city council. And I'm pretty sure a lot of us have witnessed that in city council. There's public comment, and sometimes not the language of the majority in the room. Somebody speaks in that language that is not like the majority. It might be Punjabi, it might be Spanish, and typically city council is facilitated in English. And I know a lot of you have witnessed when a person with that speaking language has been dismissed or ignored of their public comment of concern. Information in government, like government and academic, etc., is inaccessible, and too much jargon costs money and language barriers. So there's inaccessibility. I know we all get caught up on reading some of these political and legislative paperwork where there's a lot of political jargon in there, and if it's challenges for like even some academics to pull out what are the takeaways of like certain reports or paperwork, we can only imagine how much harder it would be for community members whose day-to-day is not being in academia. So there's also other ways that it's inaccessible because it is you usually hear, oh, it costs money to make more information that would be digestible to the day-to-day, like in the day-to-day language to any person, and then that it costs money to translate. It's another typical clapback to be heard whenever the community voices are being dismissed or ignored. There's dominant narratives that exclude or misrepresent community experiences, and yet, I think I moved. Oh yeah, Dominant narratives exclude or misrepresent community experiences, and yet decisions about the community are made based on those narratives. I'll give you a quick example. I think, for example, in the Salton Sea region, um, there, I'll briefly share, there's like the largest lake in California, which is the Salton Sea, was man-made and a person-made, like it was a human-made error. And it is now causing a lot of issues in environmental and public health issues because it is receding. And so a dominant narrative um, that is led by agencies is that even though the lake is receding, the lake is not the cause of the poor air quality in the region. It is the fact that the region is a desert area, and desert areas are arid, get dust storms, and that is the real reason why there's poor air quality. However, the experiences of the community members living by that lake, they've shared that before the lake started receding, they weren't experiencing high asthma rates in the communities that lived near the Salton Sea. And now that is being ignored and like that is not like the dominant narrative, that somehow the Salton Sea's degradation has to do with impacting the health of the underserved communities that live by the Salton Sea. It is the fact that it's an arid region. So that's just like a quick example on like how like the dominant narrative just excludes the fact of what communities are experiencing on their day to day, and they should be heard, and their experiences are valid, and that should be included as part of research. So, and then lastly, communities don't have control over how data from outside researchers is produced and used. Often communities get researchers that come and do their research, and then once their research is completed, they release their research paper or finding, they leave, right? So community has seen this a lot, and they usually don't have control on what are the next steps. Once like there's the research, you have your findings, and what are the next steps? It usually is up to the researcher or whoever funded the research. And then I think there's another part to this on next slide. Yeah, so people often view research by institutions and professionals as valid and authoritative, while information from non-institutional sources is considered invalid and less reliable. And this often leaves communities feeling powerless and undervaluing their own knowledge. Like the example I mentioned with the Salton Sea, a lot of times folks feel powerless when their concerns are voiced and it's dismissed. In order to make real change in our institutions, we must fight against research oppression by proactively exercising strategic choice to increase the perception of validity behind our voice. So with that, I want to go over uh, some research justice concepts. So we can move over to the next slide. Okay, so now that we have looked over some who's got the power exercise and looked at how research and justice works, we want to switch gears and talk about what goes into research and justice. And we want to start with the question of who defines and controls what gets called knowledge. And let's go with the next slide. So we have separated what is research justice into three main points. It is that mainstream institutions dominate both policymaking and the production of knowledge that informs policymaking. It is community knowledge and people's direct experiences with injustice. It's dismissed while institutional reports are taken as truth. And marginalized groups face an uphill battle challenging unjust policies and the mainstream knowledge supporting them. So we want to we will go more in depth by separating these key concepts. So let's just go on to the next slide. So our key concept number one is let me miss my place here. Okay. Redefining research and what is expertise. I think there's already like a public perception of like research equaling expertise, which it is to a certain extent, but there's other experts in the room that don't necessarily have a research background. So research, simply put, is the methodological coordinated process of investigating and learning for a particular purpose. An important part of the path to research justice is debunking the myth that expertise is limited to formal education or that research is a skill reserved for the advantaged few. So, with this, we wanted you to know that, okay, so if you are an academic or work for an institution, usually those are perceived as the researchers with that hold all the knowledge and expertise. But we want to debunk that myth because there's other experts in the room that are not being consulted with when these narratives are being constructed. Um, like the day-to-day experiences of community members, that's a big one. But usually because we tend to look at our background of work areas, is dismissed as legitimate data and information they can give. So we want to echo that in research justice, we want to redefine how we typically perceive what research is, what it looks like, and who conducts it. Next slide. Okay, and then this is still part of the first concept. People use research methods in their daily lives to acquire knowledge to improve their lives. And like people have expertise in the problems they face and the solutions they need. So let's go over to the next slide. Our second research justice concept is building legitimacy of community knowledge. We believe that no research is completely free of an agenda, nor is it ever purely objective or legitimate. Research and can and does often lead to problematic conclusions, particularly when it comes to marginalized communities. So in research, a lot of times it comes with funding. And even though you do hear of like research being conducted area, you have to look at who is that research being funded by, like who is funding that research, and be cognizant that the research outcomes may have results that benefit the funder. I'll give just an example back with the saltancy very quick, just looking at time. I mentioned the saltancy receding, right, in earlier slides, and the research shows that the playa, it's the saltancy itself is not contributing to the poor air quality. And this was found through research that a public agency funded. And when you look at research with those type of claims that sort of are not in the best interest of communities' day-to-day experiences, when you look at who funded that, it was a public agency who was charged with contributing funds with revitalizing the sea or like doing restoration. So it's interesting to see how like you see a lot of research papers and a lot of like data shows this, data shows that, and this is what we have, and these are the numbers. But you also need to look at who is that research being funded by, and there would be an agenda in there. And that's what you get. You get problematic conclusions when it's being run by a hidden agenda and not necessarily research that is done in partnership with community. And then our third concept, I can go, I think it's on the next one. Oh, again, I missed a little bit from the second concept. Research allows us to craft and manipulate political legitimacy based on our knowledge and our voice, so we can reclaim our power and achieve self-determination. So again, we should be in partnership with community, and community can use this as our knowledge, and it's our voice. and it's empowering. So we just shared an example earlier about research oppression and how usually like not consulting with community is essentially just cutting off our power because our voice is power, and that's not giving the place and time. And then next slide. Understanding the role of research institutions is our third concept. There is an level playing field between grassroots organizations and mainstream research institutions in terms of access to resources. Leveling the play field in which community organizations are recognized as legitimate partners in research creates more holistic and robust research. It's been shown multiple times, so again, yet and again and again, that research in partnership with community and like grassroots organizations actually gives the story, informs the narrative on what it is really that is going on the ground. We can't just rely research on numbers and what it shows. It has to have a community voice in there, to actually ensure that it was done. It is research justice what you're looking at, and it was done with equity in mind. And it will result to what it is really happening. And then I think the next slide will, yeah. And that research that reflects meaningful collaboration between academics, advocates, and service providers in impacted communities leads to more effective policy solution and stronger movements. Yeah, that was a lot. I'll say that. That was a lot. But you have these slides and you can always come back to these three concepts to always bring your mind back into whenever you're looking at research that's being released and what the stories are or what politicians quote whenever they mention research says this and that. But that was a brief overview on like the concepts with research justice, and we want to pass it over to Erika.
Yeah, so that was a lot of words. And now I'm going to, if we put all of this together, I'm going to give you some images to start to see a new kind of vision for the kind of knowledge and data and ideas for change that are heard and taken seriously. So next slide. Basically, this is the broad overview of what Azucena went over in depth. But on the left-hand side, so the black and white portion and gray, the triangle, you can see the way things are now, that scale on the far left of political power, more political power on the top, less political power on the bottom. And you see mainstream knowledge really having the access and power, while the experiential, cultural, and spiritual knowledge that is often at home in the community has less power and less voice. So folks who define what knowledge looks like, usually in the mainstream, are the ones who get their voices and their research heard. And while they may come and study people in the community, they don't often engage people in the community. Our vision, the one we are gradually hoping to build capacity to move towards, all of us, is a more circular model where cultural and spiritual knowledge is valued alongside experiential knowledge, which is valued alongside mainstream and hopefully informing mainstream knowledge, so that those three circles go together in an overlapping way, so that all of the different kinds of knowledge about whatever experiences the community is having or whatever problem we're trying to solve are all part of identifying the right solutions and therefore policies to make change on the issue. So what that looks like in action, next slide. is, as Azucena said, to deeply engage and be in relationship with community, folks who are directly impacted by whatever issue you're seeking to study or solve. And you can see that in this continuum, we want to just stress sort of where we are in terms of how most mainstream research is conducted, that the researchers design and the study questions, they decide in essence what the problem is, and they ask community to participate, but in the frame that they've already created. So community voices are very passive. There's no sense of whether those are the right or wrong questions. They're just some questions that researchers have decided and brought to people. And so there are huge gaps often in that about people's experience. You can see, as this slide shows, then there's a continuum of engaging in community, that, more engagement is better as you move to the right. There's a step where the community is at least helping to identify and design the research, maybe giving some feedback, providing some responses, and but the researchers still are holding the process of doing the research and deciding what is valid and what isn't, and then analyzing it. You move along the spectrum, you get to the most engaged part of the continuum, that it's really community-led and controlled research. So in those scenarios, the community is defining the issues and the research questions, and they're creating the data collection tools in partnership with people who have resources to actually conduct the study. But the partnership is deep and trusting, and that the community is a collaborator in all stages, and that the researcher is both adding their own expertise, maybe about method, but also taking leadership or taking cue from the community about how to engage in the best ways possible. This obviously is, as more folks from communities enter research institutions, more people of color get research skills, we're seeing this sort of balance out, right? That folks come with community experience and the ability to not only design questions that are relevant to community needs, but that also they're able to use their connections to bring in community as partners. And those studies often are much more reflective of the actual issues that communities face. And so that's the kind of research justice that we want to make sure we are supporting happening. Next slide. So so you can see from this how this would play a role in advancing regional equity, which is important for us. Why are we doing this? To get people's voices in the mix and to increase the equity of participation, but we're also doing it because this is the way to fully benefit from our growth and diversity in all of our regions. So in order for us to unlock all the skills and potentials that exist in our communities, we need to be able to document, measure, and appreciate the kinds of things that are roadblocks to folks, and the kinds of life experiences that may either add to people's ability to contribute or get in the way of people's ability to contribute. But either way, we stand to gain from including more voices at the table. Next slide. The other piece of this, of course, is that data matters for communities who are seeking to have their own experiences reflected in the stories about them and the policies designed. to support them. So as much of the official mainstream data that goes out there, we want to be informed by community interest, and we want communities also to have access to the kind of knowledge that's coming out of research institutions that may help them, give them tools in advocating for the change that we want to see on the ground. Next slide. Oh, yeah. And finally, this another role that research justice plays in advancing regional equity allows us to identify the solutions that are going to work. So oftentimes we see this, right, that there's kind of a mainstream bubble where researchers talk to policymakers, they design what they think is a useful solution, they go to implementation, and it doesn't speak to the audiences that they're trying to reach. We saw this particularly during the pandemic when all of a sudden community-based organizations that had deep roots in our communities were able to get the word out and engage people much more easily than government officials. And they became critical because they knew how to get the relevant information out in communally relevant ways. And that is really what makes change happen in communities, and we want our policies to be able to do that effectively. Okay, next slide. So based on that, we wanted to give you sort of 4 tenets of research that go into research for racial and economic justice. And these we have to credit our folks at the Equity Research Institute for putting this. This is when they do trainings like these, they talk a lot about the basis, their foundational understanding for all the research they do. And it basically comes down to these 4 things. That number one, the research that they engage in is justice driven. So it explicitly talks about the power dynamics and takes time to account for the power dynamics that exist in the research. It takes time and is careful about highlighting impacts to communities of color. And that often that means by disaggregating data in ways that it wouldn't have been disaggregated otherwise. It centers way to dismantle and actually to make visible anti-Black racism. It views issues through intersectional lenses. So, it's, food, I think about this in terms of communities are not just made of people who need food. They need food, they need healthcare, they need education. There are communities that are of color, there are communities that are low income, there are communities that are both. Seeing all of the ways in the complex structure of life that the way that issues play out on the ground is really important. And it's important for researchers to keep that in mind going in, even if they're only interested in healthcare policy or only interested in food justice. And then finally, as we've talked a lot about already, the research is co-created with grassroots leaders, and that those partners are clearly identified and credited for their work. Next slide. I'll move through these a little quicker. Second, research that is focused on racial and economic justice is campaign driven. So it's specific enough to be driving specific policies that are actually going to improve lives in communities on the ground. And so it exposes where public resources are and are not being spent. It points to clear policy changes or adjustments that could be made or new policies, and really doesn't shy away from talking about what is creating inequity in our communities, especially when it comes to race. And next slide. The third is our folks at, our friends at ERI are very clear that that research designed with the community is no less rigorous than research coming out of a mainstream research institution. They are very careful that to talk about how the rigor comes from doing what we call ground truthing of what's coming out of the study and how the study is being designed. So it incorporates at every point the feedback, ideas, and questions from those impacted. Often that means adding time and adding process to the research project, but that's part of the rigor of doing good community research. In addition to all the things that those of us who have done any kind of research training know, that they're backed with clear evidence, that data is disaggregated as much as possible, that we're very clear about what the limitations are, and that any analysis is shared by the community and shared with the community and ground truth checked to make sure that what we're seeing in the data that comes back is actually resonating with community members. And then finally, this is the fourth thing, is that the research itself is inclusive and accessible. And Azucena touched on this earlier. This has to do how much does community understand what is being said about them? Is the language of the reporting or the content of the research clear, accessible, and culturally responsive? Is it in the language that they speak? Does it honor the experiences of the folks that have been involved? Does it talk about them not as in demeaning ways, folks who are lacking, but also highlights strengths of the community and ways that they are already contributing to solving the problem, whatever problem is being researched, and then incorporates the work that's already being done. So often grassroots organizations have campaigns or their own grassroots research that they've been done. Is that incorporated into the research project that is happening, that the researchers are a part of? Okay, next slide. So one way to understand this is a really fun graphic I love called the Knowledge Factory. And I think we're going to put in the chat the bilingual version, much more aesthetically pleasing. This is taken from a handout that doesn't actually look like this. If you open the link, it's much better to look at. But there are two big pieces of how this works. And we call the politics of knowledge, right? The one side on the left-hand side, or if you're looking at the handout on the top, the graphic talks about how knowledge is created. And we want to acknowledge that there is a lot of knowledge inside the community. It may not be coming out in reports. It may not be printed in the newspaper, but community has ways of sharing, keeping each other updated, passing relevant information that often are separate from, if you look to the right side of that, the blue where it says mainstream, often mainstream knowledge is also being created, disseminated to other mainstream institutions, right? So that is, you have to look at sort of how is that knowledge created? And then the other part on the right-hand side of the slide is talks about how that knowledge flows into communities. So there are multiple ways that knowledge can flow. We're going to actually look at a different way of looking at the knowledge factory that is a little bit closer to analysis, that gives us a a tool for sort of analyzing how the information is flowing in any particular situation. But basically, we don't want to come across as saying that mainstream knowledge is not necessary. It absolutely is necessary. The question is how it's being created and where it's flowing, and is community knowledge being taken as valid, legitimate, and also flowing to mainstream sources. So let's break this down a little bit. I think the best way to analyze this is by using a quadrant model, which I'll show you now if we go to the next slide. So in this slide, you'll see, and then I think the next slide is the same thing in Spanish. So maybe we'll just go back and forth a little bit. So in the upper left, you see that the community, grassroots information, the core group of people driving the campaign or affected by the issue, that they have ways of passing knowledge, sharing information, and trusting each other. And often what happens is that grassroots information, knowledge in the community, flows to other members in the community. So the bottom of the quadrant is the audience. The top is the source. And you'll see if you stay on the pink side, that's often a bubble that happens, right? The community has knowledge that they're sharing with each other. They have ways of keeping each other safe, keeping each other, getting each other resources. And so that is often clear communication that happens. And then similarly, it happens on the right-hand side with mainstream knowledge. That you think about mainstream knowledge as research institutions, as government agencies, as think tanks, as other kinds of, official, legitimate knowledge, places that house what gets called legitimate knowledge. And they often talk to each other also. So they inform policymakers, other kinds of officials, agency officials, heads of organizations. So often that is a bubble that also is, that occurs when it comes to research. So let's go to the next one after this. So if on this graphic, mostly the information is flowing like this, in parallel, the work of research justice is to try to make it go across in both directions. So the right to know is when mainstream knowledge is reaching those in the community who are directly impacted. So Azucena talked earlier about the Salton Sea as a great example, right? There's all kinds of scientific knowledge that is being gathered. That knowledge is critical to communities' lives, that kids have asthma and need to know why, need to know how to treat it, need to know what kind of asthma it is, right? And so when that knowledge doesn't get to community, there is a piece of the grassroots community can't do anything in response. So from when information flows from the mainstream to the grassroots community, we call that the right to know. And that is that knowledge is that data is accessible, that research is accessible, it's culturally responsive, it's directly related to issues that they're having and useful for making policies to change. If we look at the arrow the other way, we see the right to be heard. So this is when grassroots information, so knowledge and expertise that comes from the community, that comes from day-to-day experience, living some of the issues that we all work on, that information and stories are traveling and impacting a mainstream audience. So we come back to the example that we did with the mother hearing, being heard at the city council. What would it have looked like if her story was actually valid enough for the city council to say, we need to make policy change right away? That's the kind of right to be heard crossover that we're trying to create when we do research justice. Next slide. So this is just a summary of, we want actually ideally for research justice to be created for the arrows to be going both ways, for grassroots information to be informing mainstream policy makers and other mainstream institutions, and for mainstream institutional knowledge to be reaching community in ways that it's helpful, understandable, and actually tells realistic stories about what's happening in the community. Next slide. And you have this handout, which is a summary of, but if you would like also if you're a math person and you like the grid, let me know and I can send you the grid as well. So next slide. So we are going to pause and just ask, are there any questions or reactions? We have a couple of questions just for reflection if nobody has any specific questions. And hopefully this knowledge factory this graphic is a helpful way for you a tool for you to use to analyze the situation around the issue your organization is working on in the community. But other questions, reactions, thoughts before we wind up? Any thoughts or questions? Oh, Kristal, did you want to say something?
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this information. It's so amazing and so needed at this time. I wonder, are there tools you're aware of, like planning tools in particular, of how to actually implement this? Like, when do we start engaging community? What are the kind of questions we ask, like more of the technical side of things?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, so the Institute does a lot of this stuff, and ERI does quite a bit. And also there's another program on campus here called Campus Plus Community, which talks about, all of us talk about the concept of participatory action research. And so there's actually a lot of material being developed, best practices in participatory action research, which sort of outline kind of when engaging community, what is a good role for researchers, what is relationship building look like between researchers and community. Your question about timing, the reality is that, researchers need funding and whatever. So the right time to engage the community, if they're not engaged, is now, always, so from the very earliest, if at all possible, and if not, then now, so that there's a certain amount of foundation of relationship, and both the community and the researcher are holding ownership and the ability to design what the project actually looks like. But yes, we can definitely share some other more specific technical tools around participatory action research with everybody, if that's something you'd like.
Erika, if there are any links or particular resources that you think are good ones to share, if you want to send those our way or put them in the chat, we'll include those in the follow-up email when we send the slides and the recordings. I'm sure there are others also that are interested in what tools are available. Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Absolutely. Well, if there's no other questions or reflections, I'll let you chew on all of that. We just wanted to do a quick summary. So hopefully you're walking away with a clear understanding that there's power in data, not just in informing policy work, but also in producing what we understand as legitimate knowledge. So the more that we look at what is included in what we call legitimate knowledge, and the more we are open to different kinds of ways that legitimacy can be, that community voices can be heard as legitimate sources of knowledge, the better. Who designs and interprets research matters, that oftentimes researchers miss things, either because they don't ask the right questions and don't surface what the issues that are actually happening, or when community members don't get to help analyze the numbers from their perspective. Next slide. Oops. That research for economic and racial justice is those four things: justice-driven, campaign-driven, so specific, rigorous, and accessible and inclusive across the board. And that number four, we hope that the knowledge factory, the concept of the knowledge factory is a helpful tool for you in analyzing some of the power dynamics that exist between mainstream research and community research and voice, and how they impact the policy process. And so you can use that to sort of understand the flow of knowledge, where there needs to be more or less pressure, and then how to include the voices that are missing from the table. And with that, if there are there any questions? Great. So I will turn it back to the core DataShare team.
Thank you again so much, Erika and Azucena, for such an amazing presentation and great relevant information. To wrap us up today, we wanted to let you all know about an upcoming core coffee chat in early December. We'll stay on a similar theme and hear from some local folks who are working on youth voice, and that is titled Social Capital in Action, Surveying Youth Partnerships and Assets. And that's a very exciting conversation that we're really looking forward to, and we hope you can attend. And if you more events coming, and just stay tuned also on the core website for more information. Again, thank you all so much for being here today. Please remember to fill out the feedback survey about today's coffee chat. We will post those links shortly. You can click on that link or scan one of these QR codes to provide feedback about today's training in either English or Spanish. The link and the QR codes will be open. We'll open up the survey in your web browser, so you can complete the survey even if you've left the Zoom meeting today. We wish you all the very best, and we will stay on if anyone has any other lingering questions. And thank you again.
Thanks. And some folks who were specific about some of the data inquiries that they've had, I've responded directly in the chat, and you can follow up with me. Thank you so much, Erika and Azucena. I really appreciated the framework, and I feel like there's a checklist in that presentation that I'm looking forward to kind of, I think there's like a comparison between the principles that we use and the frameworks that you've presented that will be helpful for us. So thank you for that.
One final thank you to everyone. Thank you, Erika and Azucena, for being here. Thank you, Stella, for your interpretation and keeping up with all of us. It was great to see everyone here today. Thank you.